If you've been paying attention, I think you'll notice that we're beginning to see a pattern in the book of Ecclesiastes. King Solomon, remember, one of the wisest men ever, despite the 700 wives and 300 concubines, or whichever way it was, I don't know. One of the wisest men ever speaks very honestly about the human condition. We keep seeing that phrase, that expression, under the sun, which is a reference to remind us that what he's speaking of is the human condition under the sun, a condition in which we seek earnestly after meaning in life. But frankly, here's the pattern: we can find it nowhere. That's the pattern that we see in this book of Ecclesiastes, which, if that's all we see is that pattern, it can get kind of depressing. Because all through this book, he talks about all of these things that very often we look at these things and going, wow, that's awesome. And yet he reminds us that those things, pleasure, wealth, power, they're vanity. That's not where we find true meaning in life. And we read his conclusion to the entire matter in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14. I've already read that a few times, but I want to read it again today. The last two verses of this book, he writes, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether it is good or whether it is evil." Today, I want to make an important distinction for us as we consider that conclusion. The distinction is that what Solomon is talking about there in that 12th chapter is not religion. Now stick with me for a second if you don't mind. In fact, as we read through the entire book of Ecclesiastes, the message comes through loud and clear that religion, like so many of the other things we've already seen, religion is vanity. Let's go back to chapter 5 and let's see what he has to say to us. I begin with that very first half of the first verse where he says, "Walk prudently when you go to the house of God." And the point that I want to remind us of, this is talking about, he's talking about the importance, I'm going to use the word religion, but I'm going to make that distinction for us in a minute. He is talking about the importance of religion, the importance of following God. Let's do it that way. The importance of following God in our lives. And as he is spelling out the importance of following God and being what God created us to be, he reminds us that this is holy ground. When we come into the presence of God, this is holy ground. He says, walk prudently when you go to the house of God. Can I just say, there's an interesting phenomenon going on in our culture. It's almost like two different, completely different concepts are going on simultaneously. On the one hand, religion seems to be under attack in our world today. Wouldn't you agree with that? It seems to be that there are a lot of people that are pointing a finger around the world. A lot of governments, a lot of government powers are trying to eradicate religion And we've seen cultural moves, certainly in the United States, not so much to remove religion, but to put religion in its place, to keep religion in its place. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's been, over the last number of years, maybe the last decade or more, there's been kind of a change in the way that people refer to the First Amendment protection of freedom of religion. We hear people starting to use the term freedom of worship instead of freedom of religion. And I don't know if you've noticed that, but that's not something we want to join in with. In other words, freedom of worship means we're free to worship here on Sunday morning. But that's the extent of our First Amendment freedom. That's where that is trying to go. So it seems like religion is under attack in our society. At the same time, this is what's kind of odd, it seems like religion is still very, very popular. This dichotomy. It's an important part of life for so many people. In fact, you see people use the term that being spiritual or their spiritual life is important to them. Or I believe in spiritual things. And there's nothing wrong with that word at all. But many times a person using that is saying that, they think there's probably something beyond what we see and face here in our day-to-day existence. But really what it comes back to in many cases is that many people find religion to be an important part of life. Emphasis on the word part. We have our lives broken down into compartments, into segments. I've got my work life. I've got my family life. I've got my social life. I've got my me life. And I've got my religious life. It's one of the compartments that makes up my life. And I want to tell you, that's the distinction that I want to make today. When we designate religion, let me say it this way, when we designate Christianity as being a part of life, it's the thing I do, pretty much on Sunday, that is vanity. Because that is a description really of religion, as we're going to continue to see today. What we mean by this term religion when I say religion is vanity. Here's what it looks like sometimes. Sunday morning, I go to church. I see my friends. I hear the praise team. Pastor's sermons seem to be a little shorter now after the COVID thing, right? Sounds perfect, doesn't it? Sounds like that's the capsule that makes up my experience of religion, is that Sunday morning experience. Some would say, I go to this really awesome church, and it's like, man, the band is so great, and it's like going to a concert every Sunday morning, and the preacher's so funny. I leave there feeling so good. And that's my experience of God. It's that part of my life that happens on Sunday. I want to ask a couple of questions, and I confess to you, these are hard questions. These are hard questions. I want us to think about Sunday mornings just for a second. Because what I just described is sort of the perfect Sunday morning, right? What about all that stress of getting ready for Sunday morning? Those of you that are parents know what I'm talking about. Those of you who are parents of young kids especially, I think, probably know what I'm talking about. Getting the sleepy ones up, getting them out of bed, getting them dressed, getting them breakfast. Everyone's kind of scurrying. There's all this stress of trying to get everyone ready to get there on time. What about when Pastor Rich hits those clunkers on the keyboard and it really just doesn't sound all that good? Think for a minute about what you are thinking about before worship starts. I want to give you a second just to even to think back to this morning. After you got here, when you arrived here this morning, what was on your mind as you were preparing to come in for worship? For most of us, it really probably wasn't worship. Because remember I said we come to church, we get to see our friends, and that's such a crucial part of being in church, is that sense of Christian community. But what Solomon tells us here is, he says, walk prudently when you go to the house of God. Walk prudently. Another way to translate that would be, guard your steps. I'm going to use the British expression, mind the gap. If you've ever been to Britain, everywhere you go, they've got the trains, right? And everywhere you go on the underground, there's all these signs everywhere, and they say it all the time, mind the gap. There's a gap between where you stand and where the train is, like that big. And they say, mind the gap. They don't want you to trip. In other words, pay attention to what you're doing and where you're going. And in a very real sense, that's what Solomon is instructing as he talks about the role in his time, the role of their relationship with God as they are going to the temple to worship. He's saying, walk prudently. Guard your steps. The idea here that's given is very, very similar to something we see in a couple of other places in the Old Testament. Remember Moses and Moses' encounter with the burning bush? And so here Moses just out minding his own business, and all of a sudden here's this voice, and he turns around and there's a bush and it's on fire, but the bush is not being consumed by the fire. And Moses kind of looking at it, and he hears the voice. And the voice says to Moses, take your shoes off. You're standing on holy ground. A generation later or so, we see a very similar example in Joshua. Joshua is now leading the children of Israel on the Exodus or into the Promised Land. And God brings them miraculously through the river another time. and Joshua and God, there's sort of this recommitment of the children of Israel to God. And God instructs them to circumcise again, to renew their covenant vow with him. And Joshua is roaming along, and suddenly here comes this, the Bible says a man appears before him, and Joshua says, who are you, friend or foe? And the guy says, I'm the commander of the Lord's army. So we presume this was probably like an appearance of an angel. And Joshua says, what do you want me to do? And the angel said, take your shoes off. The ground you're standing on is holy. The same idea is the idea that Solomon is communicating when he is talking to them about the importance of their relationship with God, when he says, walk prudently when you go to the house of God. It very much is that picture of walk into the house of God with reverence, with respect. We have a custom in our culture that many of us still practice. We go into a building, almost any building, maybe not a retail store, but certainly like into a church or something like that. What do we do as men? We remove our caps. We take our hats off. It's sort of a symbol of respect that we just do that. There's a similarity, but there's a very big difference. There's a similarity to that and what the ancient custom was of removing your shoes when you went into the temple. Similarity showing respect and reverence for the fact that you're, indoors and you're not going to be rude and wearing a hat. But the difference is this. For us, respect. For them, they removed their shoes as a very real, strong saying that I am not worthy to be in this place. It's amazing. That was that culture. That was that culture. I'm removing my shoes. A sense of unworthiness. We sing that song sometimes. This is holy ground. Standing on holy ground. And the next line of that little chorus is the important line, I think. For the Lord is here, and where he is holy. And when we think about a church building, and we often call this the sanctuary, it's not the building that makes it a sanctuary. It's not the room, other than the fact that yes, this room has been dedicated to being a place of worship. But what makes this a holy place is the presence of the Lord in this place. And when the Lord's presence is here, the place where you are standing is holy. Religion that is simply a part of life isn't like that. Religion where we just all kind of show up and we're all just seeing our friends and we're just having kind of our good time, that's not what Solomon is describing. Solomon further illustrates in the second part of verse 1. Let me read that part. Walk prudently when you go to the house of God, and draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. Draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. So not only do we say this is holy ground, but we see Solomon saying to obey is better than sacrifice. Now again, that's one of those Old Testament kind of terms, phrases that we hear a lot, but we need to really think through it. By the way, draw near to hear doesn't refer to draw near to hear the pastor's sermons. I mean, hopefully when you hear the pastor's sermon, it helps fulfill that, what it's talking about. But it's not saying draw near to hear the pastor's sermon. What it's saying is draw near to hear God. Draw near to have an encounter with God. Do we see what Solomon's describing here? When he talks about the importance of our relationship with God, he's saying that when we approach God realizing that we're on holy ground, and when we approach God, we need to approach God desiring to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools. Now, let's talk about the sacrifice of fools. Because there is nothing, there's not a problem with doing, I don't want to, we're talking about Old Testament times here. Solomon is not saying don't bring sacrifices. Now, we don't do animal sacrifices anymore, but I would say the same thing. Solomon is not telling us not to offer our sacrifices to God anymore. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that to not offer sacrifices in the way of the fools, the way that a fool does sacrifices. He is calling out those who perform sacrificial rituals like ceremoniously, like to be seen. I'm bringing, look at me, I brought the biggest fatted calf here. My calf is bigger than your calf. That means I'm more spiritual than you. So now translate that to the New Testament church era. I give more of the offering than you do, so that makes me a better Christian. Or I gave enough money to build a building. Or you see what I'm saying? There are people, or even maybe it's not even money. There are people who offer sacrifices of themselves, and as though that is what God wants or God needs. God needs me to offer this cow as a sacrifice. God needs me to offer this or that to the church, because if I don't offer it, the church is going to miss it. I hope I'm making this point clear, that the problem is not with sacrifice. The problem is with the motive of sacrifice. Let's see if I can illustrate it this way. Again, let's go back to Old Testament times when Solomon would have said these words. He's talking about the person that would have brought that sacrifice, that animal to be sacrificed as a sin offering. And they sacrifice the animal, and then they go off and continue just living in sin like it's no big deal. They go on and continue to live a life of disobedience. And that's what Solomon's talking about. Where is what is acceptable to God when all we do is bring some sacrifice of ourselves? We put some money in the offering plate and we continue. There's no repentance. There's no attempt to be obedient. To obey is better than sacrifice. We see that phrase many, many times throughout the Bible. And we certainly see that principle many times throughout the Bible. Obedience is what demonstrates true worship. Obedience is what demonstrates true worship. If all we do is bring sacrifice, well, I'm sacrificing just because I got up early on a Sunday and I came to church. The Lord ought to be thankful that I'm here. The Lord ought to be honored that you see what I'm saying? And that's what Solomon calls the sacrifice of fools. Why bother doing the sacrifice if there's no change in the way we live, if there's no change in our relationship with God? To obey is better than sacrifice. And so, according to Solomon, we enter into worship with reverence, with readiness. He says, be ready to hear. And again, not to hear Pastor Rich, but to be ready to have that encounter and hear from God, to be receptive to what God has to say. I think I could sum it up this way. Be ready, be prepared to interact with God. Interacting with each other is an awesome part of our Sunday experience. I love it as much as you do. But interacting with each other does not take the place of each of us and then all of us interacting with God. That's the reason that we come. And which is why I come to this third and final point, that what we're after here when we're talking about something that's not vanity, something that is real meaning, it's relationship, not religion. See, I can follow a bunch of rules. I can offer a bunch of sacrifices. And again, I'm not saying us killing a bunch of animals. I can sacrifice my time. I can sacrifice my resources. I can do the things to be seen by others. And I'm telling you that all of those things, if that's all it is, and there's nothing wrong with those things, but if that's all it is, it's vanity. We have to go beyond those things to our relationship with God. It's our relationship that makes us obedient. We obey God because we love Him, because we have respect for Him, we revere Him, we understand that He is God. In fact, Solomon says in verse, hold on, let me find it. Verse 2. He says, do not be rash with your mouth. Let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. For God is in heaven and you on earth. Therefore let your words be few. Do you see the distinction he's making here? He is reminding us that God is above us. That God is beyond us. He's different from us in that He is God and we are not God. He goes on in verse 4. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for He has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. It is better not to vow than to vow and not pay. And so when we come and we're wanting to bring the sacrifice of ourselves and our time and perhaps even our resources, when we make those commitments to God, Lord, if you'll just help me here, I'm going to do this. Solomon is saying follow through on that. But the reason that we follow through on that, the reason that we offer sacrifices is because of our relationship with God, where we acknowledge that he is God. He's up there. We're down here. I love that. I almost pulled out that old song, but I didn't know if we would know it. That old song that Phillips and Craig and Dean did, Let My Words Be Few. Because it's taken from that verse right there. He's God up in heaven, man, we're down here, let my words be few. The point of that song is, there are times, many times, more times than I take advantage of, when the best thing for me to do is shut up and listen. When I have an encounter with God, when I want to have an encounter with God, when I want to have time of prayer with God, it may not always be making a list and rattling off 35 things off my prayer list. Thanks for listening, God. We'll check you next time. It might be more of a chance to say, Lord, I'm listening. Speak to my heart. We sang this morning that song, I Am a Friend of God. And I think I've shared this with you before. I have friends that really don't like that song because it makes it sound like, it makes it sound irreverent toward God. And if all we think about is, yeah, I'm a friend of God, and yeah, we're buddy-buddy, then you know what? That is irreverent. And I think that would put me on some pretty scary kind of ground if that was the approach. But I emphasize what the verse of that song says when it asks the question, who am I that you are mindful of me? Again, recognizing that he is God. He is above and beyond us. Let my words be few. Who am I that God hears me when I call? That is where we move from vanity to meaning in life. Is when our experience of religion is not a religion that is lip service or legalistic duty or following a bunch of rules. It's when our experience of religion is a relationship with God through his Son, Jesus Christ. That moves us from vanity to meaning in life. I mean, really, religion is vanity. Relationship is life. There's what Solomon was trying to say to us in a nutshell. Religion, just like money, just like pleasure, just like power, religion is vanity. But relationship with God is life. Let's pray. Lord, as we sang that song this morning, we really do have to ask that question. Who are we that you would be mindful of us? And yet we know by your decision that we can say we are your friends because you told us that you chose to call us friends. You told us that you want relationship with us. Not religion, not following a legalistic set of rules, not offering sacrifices like fools to be seen, to be admired by others. You taught us that to obey because we understand our role in our relationship. You are God. We are your servants. To obey is better. To obey and have that relationship is life. All else is vanity. Lord, I pray this week that